Hello, and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Neill McFarland, and today we have with us Dr. James Brooks, Emeritus Professor of Geology and sometime holder of many leading positions in this university. Jim, it's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you, Neill.
Both of us have spent a great deal of time on and around this campus, and a part of it we've been linked together in trying to provide some leadership for the university.
We have indeed.
I'd like to begin by asking you to kind of chronicle your activities here at SMU, when you came here, and what are the positions that you've held? There are many, I know.
I came as a brand new faculty member from graduate school in 1952 as an ABD, a dissertation yet to write, and that was done at the end of the second year after the first year was dedicated to getting 6 new courses organized. I became chairman of the Department of Geological Sciences in 1961, and then you appointed me as associate provost, I believe, in 1968, and I moved on, became dean of what was then the School of Humanities and Sciences, and from that position in 1972 was appointed as provost, succeeding you, and remained in that position until 1981, the last 9 months of which were devoted to serving as president ad interim. And from that point, I moved into the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man as president and director, and that position I held until 1996, and I'm now president emeritus of the Institute. And that in a thumbnail is a checkered career.
And a very full career. As we think back to the earlier days, perhaps those days when we were working together in the 60s and 70s, what would you say was your vision for the university that you tried to achieve during these years?
Well, that's hard to encapsulate in a couple of sentences, but I think that I came here with stimulation from people like Claude Albritton, who was then Dean of Faculties of Arts and Sciences and later Graduate Dean. And I think Claude, and through him, me, and you too, I think, had a vision of an SMU that could become one of the truly great private universities in this country. And that implied a couple of things, one of which was a fuller development of graduate work, PhD programs as appropriate, a strengthening of the professional schools, particularly at the graduate level, and moving the university and its students and faculty much more into the international arena than we had been in, let's say, the 40s and 50s.
Speaking of graduate programs, it's my recollection that you helped to, or you did begin the graduate program in geological sciences.
That's correct. When I joined the faculty, we had a very strong master's program along with a BS and BA program. But it seemed with the development of the Graduate Research Center for the Southwest under the leadership of Eric Johnson and Cecil Green and Eugene McDermott, and through them Lloyd Berkner, that we had an opportunity to join forces with them and create a strong program in the geological sciences, geophysics, geology, geochemistry, paleontology. And so it was my privilege and opportunity in the 60s to preside over putting those two programs, the one from the Graduate Research Center and ours, together. And at one time, and really almost overnight, we had a quite strong faculty of about 16 or 17 people and moved quickly into the national and international limelight as a producer of quality graduate products, as well as, of course, as research.
It was in the 60s, too, I guess, that anthropology was added to that that makeup of programs.
Yes, that was a vision of Claude Albritton. Claude was not only a first-rate academic, but a very skillful builder of programs, and had the ability to persuade people to do things that they really hadn't thought about doing sometimes, but all of which were worthwhile. Claude realized that he had come in contact with a then young archaeologist at the New Mexico State Museum named Fred Wendorf. And Fred had begun a major program that has gone on really to this day in Egypt, and the legislature of New Mexico didn't think that was a good use of state employees' time, and Claude saw an opportunity to hire a department, and he brought Fred and I think 3 of Fred's associates in to create a nucleus of what became a very strong department of anthropology, and that was in your time as provost.
Yes. And that program has blossomed with real distinction.
Yes, it
but
has.
But then it was, I'm sure under your leadership largely, that the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man emerged, binding those two together and adding what, statistics?
Statistics, right.
Yeah.
Well, this was a result of a trip that Claude and W.B. Heroy Sr. made to a Geological Society of America meeting in Miami, Florida. And Claude knew that Bill Heroy was about to retire as chairman and CEO of the old Geotechnical Corporation. And Geotech had been bought by Teledyne, and Bill Sr. was 76 years old and not ready to retire. And so Claude and I persuaded each other that we ought to provide an office for him over in the Fondren Science Building in the Geology Department. And within a few months of his joining us, he came to me and said, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but 2 of the departments that I'm most interested in, geology and archaeology, seem to be among the least well housed on the campus. Would you mind if I tried to do something about this? Well, it also happened that Bill Sr. had some IOUs out in Washington, and between a combination of National Science Foundation money and his own personal philanthropy, Heroy Hall was built as a new home for the 3 departments you mentioned, anthropology, geology, and statistics.
Now that's become a very distinguished program. What types of enterprises have been central to that program?
Well, it is built as a research institute, and the institute over the years, and it's now almost 40 years old, has put, in addition to building and fully equipping Heroy Hall, it has put millions of dollars that it has raised into the support of graduate programs on top of what the university was able to provide for the support of those programs. And as a result, they are 3 of the strongest doctoral programs in the university, and really are among the strong programs nationally. And this, of course, moved the university, at least that segment of the university, in the direction that Claude and you and I had talked about over a good many years, building graduate programs.
Let's think back to those days when we both served as what we call provost of the university at that time, and later on it was elevated to provost. I was in that position from 1966 through 72, and you succeeded me at that particular time. Think back about that particular period. That was an interesting time to be on campus, wasn't it?
It was indeed, because in addition to student unrest, and we had far less than many universities, nonetheless we had some, and I remember very well the fact that the Board of Trustees met the morning after the Kent State shooting, for example, and the lack of comprehension on the part of some of our trustees about why that was important. So we and really Willis Tate, who was then president, had a great deal of missionary work to do to explain why this was important and to put it in context. But in addition to that, I remember very well, and I think you and I first worked closely together in a self-study that you presided over leading up to a Southern Association colleges and schools accreditation visit. And that, I think, gave an opportunity to use a botanical metaphor, pull the plant up and examine its roots and do some pruning and fertilizing.
Bill Stallcup should be given a bit of credit there,
Absolutely.
too. I was faced in my early days in the office with that particular program for the Southern Association. And Bill, to his credit, stepped in and took over the chairmanship of that and relieved me of an enormous burden and helped to construct the program. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was you and Bill put together a campus-wide committee. I remember that Alan Bromberg from the law school was on that committee, and a number of other people who've had very distinguished academic careers around here over a good long time now.
We've been through a surprising series of presidential appointments, that is, surprisingly frequent presidential appointments. You've been a part of that. Would you reflect at all on some of the trauma there and some of the ways in which things were handled?
Well, yes. I guess I have the dubious distinction, I think, of being the only provost who has served 3 presidents in rather rapid succession, Paul Hardin, Willis Tate in his second presidency, and Jim Zumberg. And this was a period of time in which I think the university has, in the person of its board, was not necessarily totally in sync with what some of the on-campus leadership envisioned as how to build a great university. And this accounted for, I think, the probably premature departure of Paul Hardin as president. Willis, I think, found himself understanding both sides and being somewhat caught in the middle. Jim Zumberg came in feeling that he had a fairly clear mandate from the board, which I think he did, but I think towards the end of his career, and this is purely conjecture on my part, nothing he ever said to me, I think Jim found himself, or at least perceived that he was on a collision course with the board and arranged what for, in his mind, I'm quite sure, was a graceful way for him to leave and go to the presidency of USC.
Mm-hmm. And then you succeeded him temporarily there as the...
I was president ad interim for the better part of a year.
And then the next man came in, and
it was Don Shields.
Don Shields.
That's right.
Yeah.
And by that time, I'd been in central administration then for about 10 years, and I had already determined well before Jim left office, left the presidency, that I wanted to be out of the Central University administration by May of 1981, because I found myself solving problems the second and third time, and I knew I wasn't solving them as creatively as I had the first time, and it was time to step out.
And then you went back to full-time teaching, or?
I went to the presidency of the Institute and a teaching appointment in geology, and which I guess I've forgotten when I became professor emeritus, but it was, I think, 1994, 1995. And then I finished my 15th year as president of the Institute in 1996, and Dick Kreisinger succeeded me.
15 years as president.
Yeah.
That's a long tenure.
That's a long
tenure.
And it's, I suppose that there are those who thought it was too long, but but we made some progress there, and I felt like I had done some things that were a contribution to the Institute and to the university, but it was then time to leave that position.
Thinking back over your career, what do you regard as the most rewarding experiences that you've had? Where have you found the greatest fulfillment?
Well, I think a couple of things. It has been a real pleasure to see the university strengthen and to be what our departed chaplain Claude Evans would call a sure enough university, in the sense of fully developed graduate programs with stronger libraries to go along with them. I also think that, and we had to make some hard decisions in the latter part of my tenure as provost, because it was very clear that we had more programs than we had budget. Mm-hmm. And you may recall that we had an internally driven self-study, and that resulted in the elimination or reduction of about 14 or 15 academic programs, including the suspension of a couple of PhD programs, which were not far enough along to have been made PhD programs, or they didn't achieve that level in the time that was expected, and so the only thing to do was to suspend them. I'm pleased to say that both of them have been reinstated subsequently, because there have been infusions of resources. The building of libraries, I think, the acquisition of the DeGolyer Library, which more than anybody else, Claude Albritton gets credit for that too, and that occurred during your tenure, but that was an important piece of the history department, ultimately the Clements History Department, Clements Center for Southwest Studies. That's all really closely related to DeGolyer. And another thing that actually, and you and I were talking the other day, Neill, and I'm not sure that either of us knows exactly how all these pieces got started, but the beginning of international programs on this campus, I think, has been a tremendous boon to our students, particularly our undergraduate students, because it's always been my conviction that a university like SMU is going to attract a disproportionately high number of future leaders of society. And it's a crime in this day and time for them not to have some exposure to the international scene and to have some comfort with other cultures. And I remember that when I became provost, you had already launched the SMU in Spain program with the help of Mel Osborne.
Mel Osborne, yes.
And there was a program in Graz, Austria that was done in affiliation, it was a summer program done in affiliation with a number of other Methodist colleges and universities. Ilya Mamontov had launched a winter term trip to the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union, largely to Moscow. And we stepped out from those. You had launched the Kansegakuin sister university relationship with Japan, and we were able to step out and add Paris and England. These things, I think, have all been very important and have really enhanced the maturation of the university.
Well, I thoroughly agree, and you gave me the opportunity while you were provost to serve as director of international programs.
That's right.
From 75 to 79, I believe it was.
I think that's about right, yeah.
And that was for me a very fulfilling experience. It was supposed to have been a half-time job. It turned out not to be quite so limited, but I have always been a strong supporter of the international programs. And if you know the students before they go and then know them when they come back, you can see how they've changed. And I've often said that those who go for the wrong reasons still come back with some of the right results.
I think that's very well put.
Yeah. Well, also, of course, in anthropology, at the research level in particular, we've really expanded our international outreach.
Well, this is true, and if you look at the programs that, the research programs that the Institute has supported one way or another, some of this is in-kind support, some of it is direct cash support. We have had associated with anthropology, archaeology, and the geological sciences research programs literally all over the world. Currently one of interest, one that I was personally involved in Yemen, and the discovering with Lou Jacobs the first dinosaur to be found in the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, Fred Wendorf's work in Egypt that Claude Albritton and I participated in and ultimately had our own research projects there. Ben Wallace's reforestation program in the north end of Luzon in the Philippines, a very environmentally important program. Archaeology programs in Yucatan, in Guatemala, and Belize, and Ecuador, on and on and on. And these are things that, one of the things that the Institute has been able to do that I have kind of stumbled into, but I feel very good about, the discovery that for many corporations that operate internationally, it is easier to give in-kind gifts than it is to give cash. Mm-hmm. They can buy you plane tickets, or they can provide vehicles for you, these kinds of things, and that's just as valuable as cash. Right. And we've been able to be a bridge between industry and the university because of our energy relationships in the Institute that I think has augured well for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yemen takes on a new significance right at the present time, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Yemen is an interesting place. It's still very much a tribal society. The Bedouin tribes are much stronger in some cases than the national government, the federal government. And when I hear people who ought to know better talking about Yemen being a center for terrorism, what they really are talking about more than anything else is the fact that it's a wild country that has a number of very strong tribes that are getting arms from a variety of sources that can be speculated about. But my personal view is that it's unlikely that it is a center for a big terrorist conspiracy in the sense that perhaps some of the countries northeast of there may be.
Yeah. Well, these programs that you just enumerated are just almost mind-boggling in their outreach, particularly as we think back over the history of this university, when we've grown from sort of an isolationist position to this kind of international outreach. It's very, very interesting and very encouraging.
Well, it's been exciting. It's been an awful lot of fun for me. This whole odyssey that you were involved in getting me into has been more fun than anything I could possibly think of. It's not without a few days of torment, but
yes, we can all relate to that at any position in administration. Well, you've done a good deal of traveling in this respect too, with these programs.
Yes, I've been fortunate. I can't remember how many times I've been to Egypt. I was just remembering this morning that the last time I was in Sharm el-Sheikh, where the summit is going on as we speak, we were on a flight from Cairo to Aswan, and it stopped in Sharm el-Sheikh, which this is now 10 years ago, and it was just a little dusty village on the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. And we arrived exactly at the time of noon prayers. And we sat on a very hot airplane for about an hour and a half until the ground crew came back from praying, and we were airborne again.
That was probably a Friday.
It was, as a matter of fact.
That's when the long period of prayer. Well, I think both of us in our roles in the university have wanted to encourage professors to be involved in the community.
Absolutely.
Not to the detriment of their own research, but to advance the significance of that research. And I know you've done a great deal of this, and part of that time has been invested in the Museum of Natural History. A logical outreach for your Institute for Study of Earth and Man.
Well, this is something that our friend Bill Stalkup got me into. He was on the board of the museum, and I think it was 1982 or 83. Bill persuaded me that that was a good thing to do, and so I accepted an invitation to join that board. And I found myself not too far down the road being program chairman, which was a community outreach kind of thing, providing programs of popular interest. And the next thing I knew, I was involved in negotiating for and bringing the Ramses the Great exhibit here from Egypt again, where we had by that time a very large and quite senior network of contacts in the Egyptian government. And the Ramses the Great exhibit was, I think, a success that the museum ought to feel good about and that the community ought to feel good about.
That was a fantastic occasion. Took over the old automobile building, as I remember.
That's right, in its entirety. And
yes.
The nice thing about it is that when you get into some of these exhibitions, you can lose your shirt. We were very fortunate. This was, talk about providential intervention. None of us who were directly involved with it had ever run anything like this before. Mm-hmm. So we didn't run it like many museums have. We ran it like a business. And consequently, we sent $1.4 million back to Egypt and had kept $1.9 million for the museum. And the Egyptian government was so enamored of the treatment they'd received in Dallas that they invited Ellie and me, my wife and me, to Egypt. Of course, we had to pay our own airfare over there, but we were their guests once we got there. And this was about 3 months after the exhibit had closed, and I said, well, knowing very well that we had sent them a check for $1.4 million, I said to some of my friends, well, what have you done with the check? And there was a good deal of stammering and foot shuffling. And they said, well, we didn't know what to do with it, so it's still locked up in Minister so-and-so's desk.
Was that when you also lost your luggage?
No, that was another time.
Another time. Yeah. One of the memorable events in your life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Both of us lost our luggage for 30 days. Mine got here 3 days after we got back from a joint sort of diplomatic visit to Egypt, coupled with some field work in the desert, coupled with 2 weeks in Italy in December. So
by that time, you'd replenished your wardrobe too, I think.
Well, in a matter of speaking, yes.
Well, that Ramesses exhibit, I suppose, really was the first so-called blockbuster exhibit in the city of Dallas, wasn't it?
It was certainly the first for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we were just very fortunate that everything worked right, including when we opened it. We learned in hindsight, and this is advice I would give to anybody contemplating one of these things, open it in the late winter, early spring, because the school kids will come, and then during the lean months of summer, they'll come back with their parents. Mm-hmm. And if you have an exhibition that is being operated on gate receipts, it's very important to keep that cash flow coming in.
Right. And you did.
Yes, we did. It's very fortunate.
Yeah. Well, now both of us are retired and still maintain connections with the university, of course, as we want to do. But do you have any reflections on how things are going and where we're going?
Well, I have been very pleased with President Turner's stewardship of the office. I think he inherited a complicated situation, not entirely free of the football scandals of the mid-'80s. And I think we had, as you and I both know, we had a number of campaigns, financial campaigns that had been announced but not really come to fruition.
Right.
And so when a large campaign, 300 million or whatever it was initially, was announced, I took a deep breath and sort of thought, well, here we go again. But he has made it happen and even enlarged the campaign and is now talking about a sequential campaign. And so I'm enormously encouraged, because no matter how idealistic you and I may be, we both know it takes dollars to make these things happen, and that was always the problem before. We never were able to put the resources where the ideas were.
That's been an ongoing problem.
Yes.
Yes, and I remember well myself that the projections that were never really undertaken, let alone reached.
That's right.
But now then we're up to 450 million or something.
Something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And no president will do everything that pleases everybody.
Oh, no.
And that's just too much to expect. But in my dealings with Gerald, I've been very pleased with him. I think he has a sensitivity to people in addition to a clear enthusiasm that he projects, and that brings people along with him. And he has a board now that is supporting him, and that's very important too.
Very important. He seems also to have related to the community very well.
Oh, I think so.
And Willis Tate did that very well. But
yes.
Subsequently, most of the presidents did not really major in that.
That's right.
And Turner has, and
yeah.
I think that's paying off. Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because you got to bring the community along with you, and you and I both know that. And you can't assume that all the action is on the campus, because it isn't. Neither can you assume it's all in the community, because it isn't there either. And that's the tough thing about being president, is riding those two horses without falling in between.
But do you agree with me that one of our great needs at SMU is to build a relationship with the city of Dallas that results in Dallas actually acknowledging us as the university in the city?
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the great challenges that remains to be accomplished or fulfilled, because you know, you read some press clippings, and there are other universities that are viewed as more preeminent than we are, perhaps with justification, perhaps not. The fact is that we have to move into that position yes. to accomplish what we both believe yeah. is the future.
Well, the alumni loyalties in Dallas are focused on University of Texas, Texas A&M, and so
That's
on.
right.
And while we have a significant number here, it doesn't match the number of their alumni.
No.
And
it's that is, I think, is a challenge, and I think the board and the president and the rest of us, but largely they, have to find a way to accomplish enough that all of a sudden people realize that there is a lot more here than they ever knew about yes. or accepted.
And there is.
Yes, absolutely.
I think we have a reason to be very proud of many of the things that have taken place on this campus absolutely. And are taking place.
Yeah.
And it's difficult sometimes to get the recognition for them on a local level. We're better known sometimes outside the city of Dallas than we are within the city.
Well, I think this is true, and of course, I think it certainly is a fact that Dallas is one of the toughest media markets in the country in terms of gaining access to it. And in fairness to those people, viewed from the other side, they're beset from all directions by people seeking publicity, some of which is merited and some of which is not. Mm-hmm. And to have to, minute by minute, make those decisions, that's not easy either.
Not easy either. Well, what questions have I not asked that that you're ready to respond to?
Well, I think we've covered the ground pretty well. I really do, and looking back over the last 40 years, 40 plus years, feel that the university is a vastly different place than it was in the early 50s,
yes.
when you and I both were new faculty members here. And it's not all good, but there's a lot more positive than negative in the evolution that's taken place in that period of time. And I feel very good about whatever modest role I may have played in that. I think that we have moved the university forward. Of course, we wouldn't be human if we didn't think, well, gosh, if we could have just done this,
yeah,
and we would have been further along.
Or not done that.
Not done that, exactly right. So but I think at the bottom line, I really feel that it's been a good investment of time and effort, and that it has, on the part of a lot of folks and people in that period of time, the university is a lot better place than it was.
Mm-hmm. I certainly agree. You came in 1952. I came in 1954 to the faculty. Where did you do your graduate study?
I did my master's at Northwestern in Evanston, and my PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle.
Mm-hmm. So. And your undergraduate work was at DePaul, is
at
right?
DePaul and Indiana, right.
Both schools. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
you have added a great deal of distinction to this university
Well,
as a
you.
scholar and as an administrator and simply as a person.
Well, thank you.
And I think you can feel very proud of what you have contributed to this university. Many of the rest of us are very happy of what you've done.
Well, thank you for saying so. It's, you know, one of the things that makes, as you well know, a job like this, I started to say bearable, but let me say possible and productive.
Sometimes it's bearable is the question.
But is the ability to have worked with as many distinguished faculty colleagues and administrative colleagues as I've had. You know, working with 4 or 5 presidents, and you've dealt with a fair number too. No two are alike,
No.
and that was trying to get them calibrated and know how to work effectively with them was a challenge.
Yeah.
But it was well worth it.
You mentioned several times Claude Albritton. I guess everyone who knew Claude has very, very fond memories of him and of the contributions he made here.
Claude was an amazing person, and more than I think anyone else, it was his belief in the university and his vision for it that early on infected me and made me, when I've had opportunities to go someplace else, it has always made it seem like it was important to stay here and try to make contributions here.
I wish that Claude were here now so that we could interview him concerning the
Yes.
university and his role in it, or he played a very key role for a long period of time.
He played an absolutely key role, and he had an amazing ability to have great ideas and then position other people to carry them out for him. Building here Roy Hall is a case in point. I, at one point, was the only person that sat between Claude and Gene Herron and Fred Wendorf and W.B. Heroy Sr., and I always seemed to be in the middle, and I never quite understood why I wasn't smart enough to get out.
Well, maybe you were the reason that it all came together.
Well, I don't know about that, but it was I've said that on other occasions that of all the administrative things I've done, I think that getting that building built with that cast of characters was more of a challenge than almost anything.
Well, we salute you for it, and I remember that one of the things that Dr. Heroy was opposed to was air conditioning the building.
Yes.
He said, well, these are scientists that work in the field, these are anthropologists, they're used to roughing it. They don't need an air-conditioned building.
Well, that's exactly right. And he finally, under pressure from the National Science Foundation, he succumbed to having air conditioning. But one of the funny things, and Bill, I mean, we could have an hour interview about Bill Heroy Sr. Himself, but Charlie Dawson, who was then director of the physical plant department, was absolutely done in by Bill Heroy. And I got a call from Charlie one day saying, Dr. Brooks, can you come down here? I've got to meet with Dr. Heroy and the air conditioning people. And I showed up down there, and Heroy had a number of psychological tools he used, one of which, this is in the days before pocket calculators, one of which was a double length, about 2 foot long log decitrig slide rule in a leather case. And he carried a lot of stuff in a big leather pilot's case, like the pilots used to carry their maps in. So he reaches down in this case and pulls out this slide rule, and then he pulls out a bunch of books. And he addresses the vice president from the air conditioning company and says, Mr. So-and-so, do you view yourself to be a typical person? And the fellow was kind of nonplussed, and he said, well, I always thought so. And Senior said, well, you generate X number of calories per day. Now we're going to have so many people just like you in the building, and this will generate so many calories, and I think you've computed twice the air conditioning we need for the building. And that literally is what happened.
Well, we've been through some interesting times.
Yes, we have.
I think Claude Albritton was on leave during the war years on some kind of a scientific appointment. Do you remember what that was?
He was in the I think the Strategic Minerals Division of the U.S. Geological Survey, looking for strategic minerals like copper and lead and zinc and things that were needed in the war effort. And that's where he met Art Richards, who was department chair when I actually joined the faculty. Claude was already dean. And Art had been on the faculty of the University of Texas and similarly went into the Strategic Minerals Division and then came in, and it was actually Art and Hemp Hosford, who was then provost, the first provost of the university, who, with Claude's machinations in the background, hired me.
Well, all things work out for good to those who love the Lord, so they say. Yes.
That's the way it goes. So,
well, is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation here?
Oh, I think we've pretty well covered the waterfront. It's been an interesting odyssey, and one that I know that has been enriched by sharing it with folks like you, and it's been a pleasure, and I'm glad to have at least begun a conversation about it.
Well, it's been my pleasure to join in this conversation, and I thank you on behalf of all the people who will enjoy this video for your presence and your comments.
Now, what kind of libel protection do I have?
You know, I've never investigated that. We need to be guarded in what we say. I suppose that's the message here. I don't think you've said anything, though, that's likely to get you into any serious trouble.
Well, you've given me some comfort then.
Okay. Well, thank you much, Jim.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure to visit again, and if it provides some snippets of institutional history that are useful to other people, then that's all to the good.
Yes. We've been talking here with Dr. James Brooks, Emeritus Professor of Geology, and as you have heard, sometime leader in the university's academic administration. We thank him much for his presence here, and we hope that all will enjoy and profit from what has been said. Thank you much. I don't know whether we're still on.